Welcome. Today we're with Scott Janish of Columbia, Maryland, the author of the new IPA. We also have Dr. Laura Burns, who's the director of R&D at Omega Yeast. And you got little old me, Doug Piper from Gourmet Brewing, Greenville, South Carolina. I want to thank you so much for spending time with us, with Scott, with Laura, with myself. I know your time is precious, and we promise not to disappoint you. We're going to drink some delicious beers. We're going to hear some fascinating details about biotransformation, and in particular, how yeasts impact that. And we hope we're going to make your day a little more delicious, one sip at a time. If I can be successful here, I hope I can bring everybody up on screen. And I just wanted to mention, we've got Scott Janish, Laura Burns, and please type there in the chat and let Scott and Laura know how much you appreciate their volunteering their time with us today. They've been on already. They've done some pre-calls. They will stay for probably 2 hours tonight, and that's a lot. So please share in the chat how much you appreciate, because I know I do. Now, we've been working for some weeks to make this happen for you, and we want to help plan future events. So help me prioritize by just clicking on the polls there. There's 5 or 6 there. Just vote for the one that you like the most. That helps me prioritize future events. I use that to gauge them. Now, let me introduce our guest today. And normally we would do ladies first, but Scott, since we started out with you, we're going to do that. Scott Janish is from Columbia, Maryland. He's the author of the new IPA book. He's the co-founder of Sapwood Cellars Brewery and a blogger at scottjanish.com. And I got to know Scott pretty early in my BJCP and Cicerone journey because he has some great charts there on his blog. Now, Dr. Laura Burns has her PhD from Vanderbilt and did her thesis on Saccharomyces. She did 5 years as head brewers and director of qualities, and now is at Omega Yeast. Now, what I want to do, how's everybody doing today?
Doing great. Yeah, thanks for having us on.
So, Scott, you look like you're in the barrel room.
I am in the barrel room. My business partner and good friend is Michael Tomsmeyer, who wrote American Sour Beers, and so I'll say this is more his room. I'll put it that way. But we have a whole bunch going on in the brewery, so I thought it'd be a little quieter to sneak over here, and it's one of those things where we have one suite in between us and our brewery, so we can't have like the whole thing, which is unfortunate, but at least we can keep our sour gear and sour tanks and gaskets all separate from our clean beer stuff. So this works out well. This is a relatively new space for us, so it's exciting.
And Laura, you don't have any cool barrels.
No, I took the nice white wall approach, so
It really looks very nice. It looks very nice. And you're a rose between two thorns tonight. You really are. All right. I'm going to cover a couple of quick things, and we're going to come back in just a quick second. Now, if you're a first-time viewer, we do monthly events with subject matter experts. This is our 66th free event, and that's thanks to supporters like Luke Pernotto, who helps me with the copywriting. Whit Lanning helps me with things. These are all crowdfunded, and we do it via Patreon. And I want to give a shout out to Dan Sakai. He's a long-term supporter of Gourmet Brewing. And if you want to be part of the team and support these events, please click on the link below, and you can kind of learn there how you can keep these events going and keep them free. Quickly, there's a follow button in the upper right-hand corner, and I do impromptu, unpublicized events. That way you get notifications. I did with Steve Hamburg, and we were talking about cask ales just a few days ago, and we're going to pursue that subject soon. Refreshing your browser solves most technical issues, reducing the resolution in the lower right-hand gear symbol there. You can select or lower res if you're having problems. Please share in the chat where you're from and even a LinkedIn link. I want these to be kind of community building events. Get to know each other. Submit your questions. I see we've already got one there, and Gary's put in a question already. Put your questions in, because the cool thing is they will answer your questions whether you're here live or not. So if you need to leave early, pop a question in there. You'll get a unique link in your email with your answer, and you don't even have to watch the whole program. It takes you right to where your question's answered. Thanks for choosing auto registration when you register. That really helps speed things up. So always check that block when you register. Please contact me if you want to do any sort of virtual speaker opportunities, private events, or otherwise, because I do speak at them. And our upcoming event next week, I'm thrilled to announce, Brasserie de Silly. We're going to be hearing from their director, and we're going to be talking about Saison Silly, direct from Belgium, and that's going to be really neat to hear the original Saison. We'll hear about the old recipe. We're in the fall, we're going to have a Brasserie DuPont with the Olivier Duclerc. And we have other events we're planning on. Now, the 17th, we are not going to have an event. That's Thursday week because that is the Homebrew Con, and I don't want to conflict with that. I'll also be taking you to the Judging at GABF and Craft Brewing Conference. So be sure to let me know what you would like. So let's get started. That's enough of that kind of stuff. I'm ready to get into all the fun stuff we've been talking about. Now, Scott, Veronica Vega emphasized dry hopping approaches to create biotransformation. And a matter of fact, she mentioned you not once, not twice, but 3 times. So what exactly does yeast bring to the biotransformation party?
Well, first of all, that's cool that she mentioned me. It's always fun because you write stuff, you put it out there, but you don't actually know who's reading it. So if someone of that caliber with a brewery that size is pretty fun to hear. Different dry hop approaches to biotransformation is a pretty tricky subject to really talk about in a quick sense. That's one of the biotransformation as a whole is one of those areas with hoppy beers that I've been probably the most excited to write about, but also the most frustrated when it comes to writing about it, because it's challenging to understand it, to get it out in a way that makes sense, or write it in a way that makes sense, and then also to get the results that the science suggests might happen. So it's just been one of those topics for me that I've just been kind of after for probably three or 4 years now, honestly. And it's just now, I think, starting to become, at least to the sensory side of things, through the work of some of the yeast strains that Laura's put together, like actually making a sensory difference in these beers. But, it really kind of started just to kind of bring us back a little bit to understand what we're talking about here with biotransformation. It really started with, and I believe there was discussion last on the last show or episode that you were talking about, where one areas of biotransformation I think everyone kind of agrees is happening with hoppy beers is that most typical ale strains can do the geraniol to beta citronellol conversion, and that's one. A lot of these, we can break down some of this more into which enzymes and all that are responsible for biotransformation of certain compounds, but that's the one that's been a focus for a while, and that's the one we know kind of happens with ale strains, and those are the ale strains that you're probably using too for just your typical hazy IPA or West Coast IPA, and so I think when she mentions different areas to focus on, that would be one I would kind of look at, and maybe Laura would think differently, but that's more of like if I'm trying to get those kind of biotransformations happening during, the early days. I believe, first couple of days of fermentation is when those happen. Because really what you'll see is the geraniol levels drop, and you'll see the beta citronellol levels go up. So for me, like in terms of that kind of monoterpene alcohol sort of biotransformation, I would be looking more at getting hops in the whirlpool that are really high in geraniol, and maybe even considering brew day dry hopping for that typical or that type of conversion. But we'll probably get into it later. But I made a theory in the book about haze levels in dry hopping, and Laura's done some work recently that's I'll have to do a correction on that, but we could talk about that later too. But I don't know, Laura, do you in terms of the geraniol, the beta citronellol type of biotransformation, is that more of a whirlpool type of situation for you rather than a dry hop focus in terms of getting that kind of conversion?
I think that, I mean, primarily anyway, you can load the beer up with the geraniol. So it's, high geraniol containing hops like Centennial, late Whirlpool, or early dry hop additions. It seems to be that the conversions kind of occurring throughout fermentation. So I think even mid to late dry hopping would be effective as well. There's even tailing kind of conversion that occurs even in package. So it's interesting. I think that, like Veronica was saying, when they are doing a lot of their dry hopping and they're focusing on this pathway, then they're really thinking about mid fermentation or kind of earlier introduction instead of kind of late dry hopping, just to emphasize that conversion when the yeast is most active.
Yeah, that's something for the new IPA, it got translated into Spanish and Portuguese. And one of the things we did is write a new chapter, and there's an appendix on biotransformation in there. And that was kind of one of the areas that we focused on in the back, was that it does kind of seem like, everyone's like, oh, this is a biotransformation dry hop edition. But in terms of that, it seemed like it kind of equaled out to the same no matter when the addition was put in, if that makes sense. So that kind of speaks to what you were saying, mid, early, late, even having some of this happen after packaging, I assume, if you're keeping it, warm.
Yeah.
But so that's yeah, go ahead.
There is a little bit of information out there towards like which strains have higher kind of abilities to do this conversion event, but it's a lot of the hoppy beer style strains, the ones that you're typically using, like Scott said. So this is something that you will witness with dry hopping. It's going from Centennial that might be a little more perfumey rose-like into this lime, really nice citrus profile, and it's not. I mean, take two compounds like these two monoterpene alcohols, put them side by side and taste them, and you're going to have a hard time picking out how different they are until they're in the context of beer and interacting in synergy with all the other compounds there. So it is I think it's an awesome, effective dry hopping for sure, in legit biotransformation people have been seeing for a long time. One that our yeast are already capable of doing as well.
Yeah, and this is one that we've done. There's other plants out there that are high in these same compounds. Hops are just a plant themselves, really. And so coriander is one of those that's high in geraniol, and we've actually done some gozas where we add geraniol to the beer around day 1 or day 2 of fermentation, just to try to get that conversion, to try to get it into the more of that citrus lime type thing, instead of the coriander that smells like you're opening your spice cabinet. It's more of the fruity thing that you're after. And so that's the first, that's the one method or one way to get biotransformation, but that is, separate from, a different topic that we'll get to, which is, freeing bound compounds. This is more of, taking compounds that are in hops in their free form and having yeast do their thing to, alter the sensory impact of those compounds. So,
well, let's do this, because we had talked about that there was actually the possibility of a good old traditional Saaz hop having new flavors with engineered yeasts. And so that's how we ended up picking Pilsner Urquell. And I'm going to go ahead and do that pour. And I understand, Scott, you were end up super busy because Mike's out of town, right? And so you're holding down the brewery there.
Yeah, Mike's out of town, and I was lucky enough to just get back a day or a couple days ago from a trip to El Salvador to do some book stuff, and so I'm really playing a catch up here. But I've had these beers plenty of times, so it's still I can imagine what everyone else is tasting right now.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and give this a pour, and maybe you and Laura can speak to it a little bit.
Sure. So I have one here. One of my favorite beers, actually one of my early beer experiences, because I got to go to Prague for a conference in grad school. And believe me, it tastes different out of a can here, but it still has a nice appeal to it. So a beautiful crystal clear lager, expect kind of a nice maltier profile on the style of a Czech Pils. I definitely love Saaz hops, and I love noble hops in general. They're really just beautiful and simple beers like lagers. So, it's nice to talk about these hops because they don't get talked about a ton. But they're really beautiful low alpha hops with lots of perfumey, herbal, kind of lemony notes to them. Nice. You can really pick them out because they'll come through like a good traditional lager should. So
yeah, I have to just comment on how gorgeous your pores look on that screen. That looks like you were talking to a commercial for the beer right there.
Well, I believe we drink with our eyes. And so it's hard to do a beautiful beer justice unless you can bring it up on screen. And we usually try and get up some close-ups so we can get an idea of the head and the clarity. And all my Cicerone friends can judge how well I clean the glass, which I do try pretty hard.
I tried to.
But I think, boy, it is brilliantly clear, absolutely brilliantly clear.
Looks really carbonated too.
Maybe a half a finger on the head. I don't know whether that was not a great pour, but doesn't have a super head. Love the maltiness and the Saaz hops. So let's talk to that. So what if we had thrown an engineered yeast into this? What would happen?
Well, I guess first it's probably helpful to kind of talk about what exactly is an engineered yeast, to just kind of get an understanding of if we did use it in a beer like that, what might happen. This is a topic that I think is super interesting, and I think there's a huge future in this sort of I like to consider it, it's one of those. It's like a recipe development thing. It's going to be one of those, another tool you can kind of reach for when you're really targeting what you're after in a beer, dialing in certain fermentation characteristics, trying to push a bunch of, biotransformation. And so when it comes to genetically engineered strains for, the purpose of biotransformation, and Laura can speak I know she can speak a lot better to the exact, the science of this, but in easy terms, I like to just think of it as that, there's most of the research that's been done on biotransformation in the past has been done with wines, and a lot of these compounds that hops have, wines share the same exact ones. And so we're really talking about these polyfunctional thiols. So these are, thiols are the hop compounds that, they're very, very low, in terms of like the hop's total oil, they're very low, like, 1% or something of the actual hop. But they have such a low sensory threshold that it doesn't take much to really get it, to have an impact in the beer. And so what these well, I should say, going back to the wine test, what they've kind of found in the wine world is that there's certain yeast strains that can unlock some of these, so each hop has a handful of free compounds. Then those you can kind of think of as getting into your beer relatively easily. They're free. They're just, once they're added to a dry hop or whatever, they'll extract into your beer. But there's also bound compounds. And these bound ones are just, they're almost like just little bits of potential in the hop that unless you kind of can trigger them to be freed, they really don't do much, and they'll just kind of, they were there in a state that you don't smell or taste, and they kind of leave in that same state. So what they've kind of found is you need certain enzymes to free these compounds, to free these bound thiols in particular. And we're talking mostly about the thiol 3MH here, which is, a grapefruit, rhubarb is another descriptor for this particular thiol. And so what you need to free these thiols is an enzyme called beta lyase. And, most yeast strains, especially used in the beer world for, hoppy beers in particular, aren't capable of creating this enzyme on their own during fermentation. And without that enzyme, you're not going to unlock those bound compounds. So what they've kind of found is, all right, looking at what they can do now with these genetically engineered strains is they can, target genes from different yeast. And so, say you find a wine yeast that has a gene, and in this case, it's the IRC7 gene, which they know is responsible for creating this beta lyase enzyme during fermentation. So you can, pull it from, this is a broad sort of stroke of how it's done. You're pulling a gene from one yeast, inserting it into, a hazy hoppy strain. And then, so now that strain will have the potential for, this biotransformation or this unlocking of compounds. But the other kind of trick here is not only can you insert it, but you can also turn it up, overexpress it a little bit. So that, this enzyme activity is at even higher rates, which can enhance the freeing of these compounds. So, going back now to Saaz, you can see in the chart that's up, Saaz is really high in these, that you can see on the far left corner there, really high in these. They're called these cis 3MH precursors. So, a precursor is the thiol, but it's, in its bound form. And so you use one of these genetically engineered strains, it's capable of releasing some of those bound compounds and getting it, not only just barely above threshold, sensory threshold, but, much, much higher, which can have a huge impact on what you're tasting and what you're smelling. And essentially it could, take a hop like Saaz and really, make it, super grapefruit forward, for example. So I think if the beer that everyone's drinking now, if it was fermented with, one of these engineered strains, it would be a completely different beer, I think, for the most part, especially in that beer, because there's not a lot going on. That's just, that's it's not a whole bunch of malt. It's very clean. And I think that's type of beer where you'd really, really see the differences there. So I think, Laura, if you want to talk about your strain that's coming to market or is on market soon, and kind of how you look at it in terms of what it would do for that particular hop.
Yeah,
Scott,
I think
Laura, before you run with that, so you were mentioning wine and wine yeasts, which has completely caught me off guard, and I'll show my ignorance but what exactly were you saying associated with biotransformation and wine yeast?
Yeah, so I mean, in the wine world, they already have a handful of strains, and they've done their own kind of engineered stuff too. But there's strains out there like Vin 7 is a wine strain that is capable of doing, creating this enzyme that can unlock bound compounds in hops. So, over the years, and when I was writing the book, and since I've been co-fermenting beers with, a typical ale strain, and a wine strain that is known to bioconvert. And it's been one of the more exciting areas for me, but then I just get so frustrated because any sort of biotransformation that was happening, just having a little bit of that wine yeast in would change that fermentation profile of the beer. So, maybe it was doing some of this bioconverting and unlocking some of these flavors, but it was also creating some phenols or other things that I just were distracting from the what I was after. And that's where I think this is particularly exciting, is because they're, taking what I wanted so much in that Vin 7 strain, inserting it into a hazy strain, and then, not allowing it to do the other things, and actually turning up the one thing I wanted to do. They're making that even, more aggressive, I guess you could say. So that's, for me, this has been, I've been all over this because I've been trying to do this for so long, and it's just been frustrating. And now it's kind of, the best of both worlds.
That's experimenting. That's how it goes,
That's the best part. So, but Scott, I'm still a little confused, so you'll have to excuse me because I'm slow. What is biotransforming in wine? I mean, they're not.
I can lean on that a little bit.
Wine?
Yeah.
So
there are.
Well, what Scott was saying earlier, the same precursor compounds that we're talking about in hops are also in wine grapes, and they're at high levels as well. So I would say in beer and with the precursors that are also present in malt, you have thousands of fold of excess potential that's not even being accessed or released as an aromatic flavor. It's just trapped there and locked into the malt compound that's not aromatic, or the hop compound that's not aromatic. So same thing in wine. It's locked into the grape compounds, these precursor compounds. And it's interesting because like what Scott was saying is true. You can't just take a wine strain that's known to have this high beta lyase activity and accessing these compounds and converting them to the free thiol, because they don't do it in beer either. They don't do it to the level that you would need it. So beer has a lot of nitrogen, and that plays into complex gene expression, lots of regulation in yeast. And if they don't need to use a gene, then they don't want to turn it on. It's just kind of a waste of their time. So they don't turn this gene on in beer fermentation because there's so much nitrogen around, and it just doesn't need to be on.
So I guess prior to this, I did not realize biotransformation occurred outside of beer and hops.
Oh yeah,
but you're saying it's
there's
very
been decades of research in wine, and we're just tapping the surface in beer. So yeah, it's definitely a very well established event in wine yeast. There are strains that are advertised a lot of the time as high beta lyase or high beta glucosidase activity, and used for more aromatic white wines, particularly. So the region that is very well known for the complex thiols that we're talking about is the Marlborough region and the New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc wine. So if any of you beer drinkers out there also dip your toes in wine, then you know exactly what we're talking about is this thiol compound. It's this over-the-top grapefruit, passion fruit, sharp kind of rhubarb character that Scott's talking about, giving a little bit of maybe even cat pee, which is 4-MMP, which is another thiol compound that hops and grapes have. So all these kind of shared characters of Sauvignon Blanc wine from the New Zealand kind of Marlborough region come into beer now, because we're able to basically turn on that pathway and allow the yeast to have that beta lyase activity. Previously, like really no brewing yeast is exhibiting levels that are giving you an appreciable like sensory threshold level of these compounds.
And does the wine industry use the term biotransformation, or do they have another word for it? They do.
They do.
Okay.
Yeah, you just like Scott gets into the literature a lot, so I'm sure he sees this, but like it's hard when you're mostly focused on like your raw materials in beer and you're not thinking outside into other industries. But the wine industry has been doing this for a long time, and they're actually the experts we use for the analysis and the chemistry behind the strain development that we did at Omega Yeast.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. If you start looking back at the research, how many years ago they were talking about these same thiols and these same these same flavors that we're after in hops. And honestly, I've been doing a bunch of beers here combining the two. So making hoppy lagers with, wine juice or wine must, sort of combining these two styles and, combining this biotransformation thing from, taking advantage of both the precursors in hops and the precursors in wine grapes and just letting them go in a beer. It creates really fun, intensely aromatic beers that, in our tasting room, people aren't really sure what they're drinking sometimes when they have these, and that's kind of awesome.
It's really cool.
So yeah,
Well,
I would say
I've
with
got to
this,
get out more, because I thought all this biotransformation started with hazy beers. So, but that's great. I mean, that means there's a lot of established science.
One more note, with this beer, we've done pretty much the same recipe, a straight up Pilsner recipe. We're using a German lager yeast that we amplified this beta lyase activity in. And we only used us hops, and we had 2 beers side by side, recognizably distinct. A lot of the preference leans towards the version with this beta lyase activity because it gives a crisper profile. It cuts through the malt. It allows like the grapefruit, like Scott's saying, to come through a little bit more. It's not aggressive. It's not overpowering. It doesn't dominate, but it has this like elevated hoppy note. And I think when people make their Pilsners, they're really looking for that kind of enhanced hoppy note, and they don't want to battle the malt so much, although malt's really important, and it's also adding precursors. So it's interesting to kind of think about. I mean, drinking this beer right now, I'm thinking exactly like the audience, like, wow, what would that be like with this stylized strain?
And I could speak a little bit to that, because I've used that German lager strain that she mentioned a couple times now at the brewery. And one, just fermenting cold with it, with all Nelson Sauvin through the entire thing. So whirlpool, dry hop. And it was great because, I'm most of the time when I'm doing experiments like this, I'm just taking from a larger batch. So before we pitch yeast, I'll fill my homebrew gear up with, wort essentially. So we're not, it's not pitched, no yeast has been pitched. It's treated the exact same as the big batch. And that's where you can really do side by sides to see, how these genetically engineered strains compare to the strain that we're used to and we use all the time here, which is, a London Ale 3 yeast from RVA lab in Richmond. And it just like she was saying there, it's sharper is not the right word. Brighter is probably a better word. It's just this higher sort of top note. Almost just feels like it's been dry hopped more. The malt character is very much, and this is the same for the ale strains to me. It's more subdued. It kind of stays out of the way a little bit. I get some flack here at the brewery because I think it's just years of trying to get so much hop character in beers that I don't love malt, especially when because it just competes for flavor and aromatics. There's certain styles that I really like them in, but when it comes to hoppy beers, I like that malt profile to be low. And tasting these side by side again, it was just it's not that the typical ale strain was like super malty, but you notice it more when you taste one next to it. It's like thinner in like a good way. Like the mouthfeel is still the same, but it's just the malt is it almost just tastes like it had more whirlpool hops in. It just tastes like it was almost it's slightly dry hopped, but it's not like over the top, which is kind of what I really prefer in these kind of beers or these kind of things, because you want to know what you're doing is having an impact. I think you want to be able to taste it, you want to be able to smell it, but you also want to be able to control it. And so if a character of a fermentation is just so strong, every beer you're going to do is going to taste similar to that. And so that's where a lot, using these strains, but then using different hops higher in precursors than others. We can talk about when you can possibly use them to really take full advantage of these strains. There's still a lot to experiment with, at least on my end.
Yeah, I think
sounds like these yeasts can convert what we think of as a pretty classic Pilsner into something that is not your father's Pilsner.
Yeah.
Yeah, or your mother's. Who knows?
All right. Well, let's pour another beer because we're getting into the program. we chose the Voodoo Ranger because that gets into more of a classic IPA profile. And so I think what we're going to talk about on the Voodoo Ranger is maybe what kind of characteristics could have come out of something like this IPA with engineered yeast, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this is one of those beers I've had many times, not recently, but it's the predominant hops in this one are Mosaic and Amarillo. Mosaic being one of my favorite hops I can lean on the most. It just seems like one of those varietals that it doesn't have as much swing from lot to lot or year to year. It's a reliable hop. And then the complete opposite of that is Amarillo, which to me has been one of those hops that has been harder and harder to get good crops of and good batches of. But I think that's where a brewery like of this size has a huge advantage, because they are buying hops in so many pounds that they have the luxury, and I'm sure they all get excited every year to go out and sample a bunch of hops, rub a bunch of hops, and hand select the ones they use. And so that's a huge advantage to some of these bigger breweries. But definitely one of those beers I think is a little maltier than a lot of the IPAs that come out now. And I think that's, using one of these engineered strains, I think even if you use that same malt build, I think if you taste it side by side, it would kind of cut through that a little bit. So I wish we could get these brewers on and have them actually do that with some of these strains, because that would be fun to recreate a little side experiment with these. And I'm sure they do that stuff all the time, but it'd be fun for me to taste it and smell it. But in our experience, it definitely cuts that malt character a little bit. It allows the hops to shine, and surprisingly, you're just getting so much. These strains do so much with just the malt precursors. I mean, I've been amazed by some of the charts that Laura has shared with me that you're getting 3MH levels above sensory threshold without even using hops, just from the precursors in the grain.
I put a little image up for you because
so I think that's
yeah, this is just kind of an example of, so 3SH is another common way of referring to 3MH. They're the same compound. So you're going to see that in the literature. It'll get a little confusing, or probably hear people talk about it differently, but they're the same thing. So what we measured is just in wort alone, how much we could release, how much of this compound we could unlock from the malt precursor compounds. And the parent strain is the same one that Scott's talking about. London Ale 3 or British 5 is what we sell it as, our OYL 011. See here, there's like absolutely no activity in beer. And this is without hops. So normally you'd see some compounds coming through because they're coming through in hops. But then our Cosmic Punch is a new strain that we'll be releasing soon. Accesses the malt precursor and cleaves it with the beta lyase activity and releases it into this nice aromatic profile, which we typically in malt alone see this come through as like a high level of passion fruit, and a nice complement to kind of these newer hop varietals that come through much more tropical.
Yeah, and I just actually opened up, we canned or crowlered, I guess we should say, a smaller batch today with the Cosmic Punch. And so this beer right here is the Cosmic Punch strain in a pale ale, almost kind of an IPA, but it's got the Michigan Chinook, which is already, it leans a little more grapefruit than the Chinook that I've been more familiar with. And the new variety called Talus, which was 692, I believe, before it was named into Talus. And it's just it's so bright. The malt character is just a supporting cast in it, and it's just like like you're smelling like pink grapefruit or something. It's pretty great. It's like this light fruitiness that it's super enjoyable. And it's amazing to me how, again, just from the malt alone, you're getting, just to kind of step back a little bit, there's been some research just this, I think it was published this year, where they examined some hazy IPAs, commercial ones, and tested them for thiols. So, they wanted to see how much of this 3MH or 4MMP was in, just in these commercial IPAs, and the answer was very little. There wasn't a lot in there, and this, these strains are doing way more than, with just the grain than we were doing previously with hops as well. So it's kind of mind blowing when you think of it that way. But it's also just how you can sort of tweak it to enhance that even more with certain varieties, and when you introduce these hops to beer. I think it's interesting with a hop like Saaz, because to me that's, we've talked back and forth, Laura and I have, and we've done some experiments with mash hopping, throwing in some of these hops that
it sounds bizarre.
Yeah, but I mean, you're introducing these compounds, because really my goal is to get as much complex set of hop compounds as I can into that fermenter. And if you're doing these low alpha hops early, you're not doing much in terms of bitterness, and you might be just enhancing the amount of precursors that are getting into your beer that these genetically engineered strains then can do more with. And I guess
there's just like a little bit more added activity from the malt enzymes alone too. So you're there's complex forms of the precursor that the yeast is having a harder time accessing. But adding hops in the mash kind of helps prepare that for the yeast during fermentation. So it's really like packing in precursor that then the yeast gets to and cleaves and releases in fermentation.
Would you say it's almost easier for these yeast if it's introduced in the mash, because there's something about all the other enzyme activity in the mash that's like softening the what it takes for the yeast that are creating these enzymes to then convert them?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I would think.
I find the best beers have a lot of balance, and you need a certain amount of malt to balance the hops. And what I keep hearing is these engineered yeasts could or will reduce the malt level. So
they won't. They actually help amplify character out of the malt that's there. And it's into a character that is more hoppy like, because it is similar to the same compounds that you're finding in hops. But it, like a wort alone, just malt fermentation is alone kind of juicy. So it's a different idea of like what, even with a hop, you think of hop as being bitter and having all of the other oils that Scott has talked about in his book coming into play for the flavor. But isolating these molecules during fermentation from just the malt alone, it's not diminishing malt quality. It's actually kind of pulling out new character from the malt, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I think that, I'm glad you said it like that. That's a lot better, because I keep saying it's not as malty, but it's just as malty. It's just that the yeast is, yeah, exactly what she says, bringing out these fruitier compounds from that malt, which I think is a good distinction to make. And I think, it's my understanding that it's mostly the pale malts that have more of these precursors. So the more a malt is malted, essentially, it's going to lose some of these precursors. So that's where you just like that Pilsner. It's just pretty much all Pils malt, right? And so that's probably going to have a lot more of these precursors for a yeast strain like this to do. And because it doesn't have any of those other, caramel malts or anything like that to really, muddy the waters in terms of just what that beer is doing, I think that's a beer that would really showcase really the potential of enzymes.
Yeah, and then I would just say, like, the barley itself is it's going to be dependent on the growing region and the variety. So even your base malt that you're sourcing might be different from somebody else's base malt. In wine, they talk a lot about terroir, and it's going to come into play here a lot in the hop selection, but also in your malt selection.
Do you think that's potentially going to be something that these maltsters will start advertising, the
I hope
precursors.
so.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the cool things about malt is if you just make a higher Plato wort, you get more malt character, right? So like you can pack in precursor by just getting like a little bit higher in ABV or a little bit more starting gravity. But yeah, we've found some of our base malts vary quite a bit. We have base malt that we use for our yeast propagations, and it's been the winner for all of them so far. And it's, very simple 2-row.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Well, let's actually talk about a beer that actually has some biotransformation characteristics. And we chose the Bell's Official Hazy IPA as the last one. And so I'll do that pour if you want to talk to that just a little bit. And when we get done with the pour, we're going to actually hear something from the brewer there at Bell's, Andy Farrell.
Scott, why don't you talk about like your perceptions on hazy versus kind of traditional West Coast or early and late hopping kind of?
Yeah, like I mean, I guess the obvious difference between a lot of the hazy and West Coast is just the bitterness and appearance, dryness and sweetness to me. A lot of the West Coast beers have that. They're crisper, they're cleaner, they're higher sulfate. It's funny that I was just overseas traveling and I got asked the same question multiple times, and it was one I was just not prepared for, and it was everyone is confused. What's the difference between a hazy IPA and a juicy IPA? That's kind of where there's confusion around the world now when they're looking at what we're doing in the U.S. And I think that's just like well, it's kind of the blend of the two. I think if you think back, it's the Alchemist. They were doing beers that were hazy, have more hop flavor, but they were still they're still drier. I think they were still higher in sulfates. And now you look at like the hazy juicy IPAs, and they're just a little bit more over the top, and they're sweeter, they're more viscous, they're a little hazier, sometimes even almost turbid. A lot more chloride, less of that gypsum, so it's not as sharp. It's
no caramel malt, like all like more like even like adjunct based, kind of giving a different mouthfeel on it. Yeah, I mean, there's some really interesting.
Let's hear what brewer Andy Farrell says from Bell's Brewery.
And then driving on those fruit characteristics in the hops that we enjoy so much. So when I drink this beer and assess the aroma, for me, a lot of stone fruit. I get peach notes. I also get a good amount of pineapple, and maybe there's some generic tropical notes as well. Beer has a soft bitterness. One thing I'd point out about this beer in comparison to some of the other hazies or beers done in this vein, this beer certainly finishes drier, so maybe not as sweet as what people are used to in this style. For us, we were really trying to drive on drinkability and showcasing the hops. So talk about the hops a little bit. The feature hops in this beer are certainly Mosaic and Eldorado. And then we use Azacca, Amarillo, and Citra in support. So, honestly, these days building IPAs, kind of the magic number for me usually is 3 or 4 hops at this point. This one, through the developmental process and different things that we had going on at the time we landed on those 5, which are all certainly amazing modern hops that help drive the character in these beers. I'm coming up on 4 minutes here into this video, so I'm going to let everyone go. I hope everyone enjoys the event tonight, and I hope you enjoy the official IPA if you're trying it right now. And look forward to catching up with everybody soon. Okay, cheers. Best.
Cheers. I just want to talk back to the previous podcast where John Mallett was on, and he said that the nice juicy tropical hops kind of need a a dancing partner. And I liked it because it is like, I mean, recipe development, building character from your hops, not just relying on the sexy hops or the cheater hops, as Scott calls them, and making sure you have like the technique to layer in your flavor, whether that be a variety of hops or like Scott does very carefully choosing where he adds his hop and his additions.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too that some of those, cheater hops are sometimes they can't. I would agree with that statement, as they do sometimes need dancing partners. To me, Galaxy has been one of those hops for me. And some of those hops that are more candy like forward, so they have like a candy fruitness. Yeah, it's like they're great, but they almost need to be balanced with something else. They're not usually as potent, at least in our experience. And so that's like, a Galaxy and Citra or a Galaxy Nelson is great. Galaxy Nelson they're pretty opposites, but they just come together nicely. You have this like super fruity wine-like kind of thing. It's also just, hop quality is so huge in these beers too. And it's sometimes that's, as home brewers or smaller breweries, you kind of just get what you get. But, it's like Galaxy to me. When Galaxy is just spot on, it tastes like, fruit stripe, or it smells like fruit stripe gum to me. And now a lot of times we get Galaxy and that smells kind of like, peanutty. And so it's just, that's really when you're going to have to start pairing these hops with other hops, especially if you've contracted a bunch of them. And that's another area too that I'd be interested in doing if hop quality, I was just, like I mentioned, I was in El Salvador, and they can't get a lot of these hops. They can get what I call, we call them like cheater and cheaper hops, but they can get a lot of these cheaper hops. If these genetically engineered strains could make their way to them, I think that would be a huge welcome for them, because then they can really start to transform some of these hops that they've, a lot of brewers might overlook, or it's the only ones that they can get, that I think they could really improve the quality of the IPAs, overseas where hop, just getting raw materials is a lot more challenging.
Yeah, I would. You were talking a little bit about like the noble hop, and in your figure, obviously, like from the thiopotency index, there's a lot of these like traditional hops there that have like huge bound potential, and they've been my favorite ones to play around with. The Chinooks and Cascades, and the ones that are pretty widely available, but honestly, like even their production acreage is kind of turning over a little bit. So I think it's important, even if you're not getting the right selection, or being able to blend, but also using other tools you have at hand, and hopefully these engineered yeasts will come in and allow people to get the right aroma profiles from hops that may not have been the best selection, or might not be the variety they're looking for.
So we did a whole program on Sierra Nevada's Celebration Ale. And they go to great lengths with all these super fresh whole cone hops, and they get them in immediately. And I'm sure you've had it. It's a fabulous beer. So you more or less saying, because people say, well, I want to clone Sierra Nevada's beer. And you go, who can get whole cone hops that are prime from the field? 48 hours later, they're in the fermentation tanks. But are you saying essentially the potential is there that someone could take, dry hops of some average quality, what small brewers could get, and have the potential of getting something as good as a Celebration Ale from an engineered yeast? I mean, approaching it?
Scott, you could talk.
I wouldn't go that far necessarily, just because, and honestly, I have a question for Laura in terms of how much these strains are doing with dry hop additions post fermentation. Because I think this is, to me, I look at it more as potential for the early side of brewing. So yeah, using hops that aren't as, the quality isn't as, as great as you would like. if it doesn't, my kind of rule is if it doesn't smell good in the bag, it's not going to smell magically better, especially in the dry hop. And so, it's my kind of understanding that a lot of this conversion or the unlocking of these compounds is happening in the yeast cells themselves. Is that your understanding? And if fermentation is over, I don't know how much you would get from these, but that's a question for you.
Well, so like Scott said initially, these are well under like the 1% of total oil that you're getting in your hops. So there's no way thiols are going to kind of come in and replace a celebration ale. It's just not going to happen. There's so much other positive hop character that you're going to have to select for those high quality hops. So yes, there's pretty good evidence that these precursor compounds are being converted during fermentation. So the expectation is that they're extracted well in the brew house and they're not volatile, so they're going to make it to the fermenter. They're survivables. So you're going to pack it in on the hot side with like mash hopping techniques or some whirlpool additions, and then the hops with a lot of free thiols you want to be able to add during fermentation, because those in a dry hop, because those are going to blow off and be completely lost during the hot side processing. So yes and no. There's definitely ways to get more out of your hops. I think squeeze more juice out of your hops kind of approach to using these strains. But the hops kind of have to have juice in them to start. They have to be decent hops. And not something like Scott says, when you do an initial sensory on them, you smell an onion and garlic and you're like, oh, I can make this work.
Yeah.
You want to make sure that hop going in is something you're pretty happy with and you think alone would be good, but you're expecting to get maybe a little bit more out of it.
But I like the idea of the potential of drawing out in decent hops, maybe some extraordinary characteristics that otherwise would be missed.
Yeah, that's definitely how I, look at them and why I get so excited about them. But as Laura was talking there, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just it just occurred to me, if these hop compounds, these thiols, these cis precursors, if are they in the beer or are they in the hop material themselves? So, in other words, if you have a whole bunch of spent hops, I've just dry hopped, are these precursors still in the spent hops, and I could then use these hops in the mash and still get some.
Isn't that the whole start
conversion?
of mash hopping? That was the whole idea for mash hopping from the start, is that you could get those more bittering compounds and reuse them from previous brews and get better utilization out of them in the next subsequent brew. And they would take them and put them into the mash and reuse them. So I honestly, we haven't done that level of experiments, but we've definitely done the mash hopping. We know the mash hopping accentuates kind of the final character of thiols in the beer and measurable amount of thiols in the beer, which is from us, you only get 20% utilization of the bittering units, kind of like getting nice hop quality out of the mash. But we found that mash hopping is a better method of introducing and packing your wort with precursor than a whirlpool addition. So something that kind of blew our minds a little bit.
And just like I wrote a little bit in the book, another reason I like this idea so much too is that, I make an argument for mash hopping in terms of just, alpha and beta acids from hops have been found in some studies to, complex some of these problematic metals that could cause oxidation down the road, that are coming from the grain. And so essentially, if you can get some of these numbers lower, but before you're packaging the beer, that seems like something worthwhile. But if at the same time, if you can increase precursors that can enhance the fruity perception of your beer and maybe have a little further insurance against more beer stability, which is definitely an issue in hazy IPAs in particular. That's exciting stuff for me. And then if you can use spent hops, and that I think you're gonna some of those the bittering potential from those I think would be less at that point too. So you're not really paying for them, and you might still have precursors. And I guess you'd have to have some good timing to be brewing on days you're dumping dry hops. But it's all kind of exciting, and something that we're definitely, I'm looking forward to experimenting with more here.
Yeah, when they talk about biotransformation being magic, it is. And there's quite a bit of like stuff that we don't really understand yet, but there's data out to suggest the benefit of mash hopping and being able to access these styles with these genetically engineered yeast.
Well, that's a good summary that you've got there, Laura. Thank you. And Scott, how would you summarize for somebody that maybe came in late the yeast magic that we've been talking about? Just could you capsulize it in 1 or 2 or 3 sentences?
Probably not in 1 or 2 or 3 sentences, but essentially it's just another tool in the toolbox for brewers to dial in the profile they're looking for, I think, in a beer. We only just talked about using these genetically engineered strains to encourage biotransformation, unlocking bound potential in fruit and in hops. We didn't talk about how some of these strains are created to, not allow certain yeast strains to have certain phenols, or, really encouraging certain aspects of fermentation character to shine, and turning off genes that are responsible for others. And so I just think, there's so much potential here. I was trying to hint to Laura the other day. I was like, can you make a strain that we can ferment our big imperial stouts with, that flocculate well, or very neutral? And it's just like, because there's every time I really love a yeast strain, there's always something about it I don't necessarily like. So,
and we've done a little bit of fun
more
things like, remove phenolics from the Hefeweizen strain. And
yeah.
I mean, it's like, there's a lot of very simple, easy ways to like change known pathways in yeast without introducing any transgenic material, or really, preserving all the strain's original characteristics that are desirable, and just tweaking very, very specific events. So when we built our POF minus Hefeweizen strain, we just took a naturally occurring variant of that gene that is required for phenolics, that's found in Chico, and we just changed the Hefeweizen strain to that allele, or that version of the gene, and the rest of the strain is exactly alike. It was actually one nucleotide out of 12 million base pairs. It's crazy. Yeah.
Well, it is the top of the hour, and for a lot of people, they can only commit about an hour to watch this, but we have 17 questions. So I'd like to jump into those questions. And for those of you that need to leave, thank you so much for spending this time with us this evening. This was a lot of fun. Next week, we've got Brasserie de Silly, and we're going to be talking about the original Saison and the original Saison recipe. So that will be really unique and special. I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you'll join me. And we're going to switch over to the questions. And I'll look to you guys to just tell me which one. And I want everybody to know everybody gets one vote. So if you don't have a question, or you look down through the questions, all now 18 of them, and you want to vote one up so that it's answered quicker, the higher the vote, the quicker we will answer that one. And we'll continue to go in that order. So the votes drive the order in which we answer these. So Johan has Johan has the first question, and it is the most popular. It says, do you have any experience with Brettanomyces and its potential for biotransformation?
Yeah, a little bit. So Brett, let's see, I'll have to think back in my brain archive a little bit here, but I think Brett is doing more of the, it's more of the terpene related stuff, right? It's the beta glucosidase that Brett is able to produce, which can release, that's another enzyme that can free some bound hop glycosides, which can enhance more character in some of these hops. So it's the same kind of thing in a way. But the big difference between what Brett is doing and what like a genetically engineered strain is doing is that, that's doing more for thiols, which I think is more potential to actually smell and taste. Whereas, enriching some of these terpenes is definitely, I think, creating more complexity, but I don't think it's bringing it to a level that can really just completely change and make your beer go just like, wow, this is the best thing I've ever done. And that's just because, the sensory threshold of some of these. But there is, a thing, called synergy, and that's, you have all these different hop compounds kind of play off each other. They work together. There's certain ones, high levels of, or 4-MMP, for example, has been found to lower the taste threshold of a certain monoterpene alcohol. So when 4-MMP is in the beer, and the same amount of these, say linalool, for example, it can actually be in at a lower, or the lower rate, but taste like it's in there in a higher rate. And that's just because it's in there with 4-MMP, which, synergy is kind of like the dance partner thing. You have certain hops that have a lot of these of high, most hops are unique probably because of they're high in certain compounds. There's a lot of compounds in these hops, but I think it probably comes down to, certain ones or a combination of ones. And combining those with other hops that are, maybe similar, but have higher amounts of different, I keep saying just different compounds, but it's just a broad way to say that, they really work together and can increase each other. But in terms of Brett, the only problem with Brett is a strong flavor on its own. And so that's kind of the same thing as with fermenting with wine yeast, is that you're going to get those Brett characteristics depending on which one you're using.
Yeah, we need to make some POF minus Brett strains.
Yeah, that would be fun.
I would agree with Scott. The main activity Brett's just been described for biotransformation of hop compounds has been the beta glucosidase activity. Brett and Aromas specifically, we have a strain that grows on cellubiose. It's the way we screen for that activity. It can actually, break down that carbon source with the enzyme, but it similarly breaks down the glycoside-bound monoterpene compounds. So that for sure is activity in not every Brett strain, but specific ones that have that beta glucosidase enzyme. And one of the things that I think we didn't touch on, but I think is really important, is genetically engineered yeast. We're taking enzymes that are frequently used in brewing that are made from recombinant organisms. I mean, we're trying to take the approach that's maybe convenient, but also safe, because you're consistently we've already made the decision to use these tools. So as a way of just trying to take away a little bit of the concern, just either it's a lot, you can learn about how these yeast are made, and it's either one, trying to take already known yeast characteristics and amplify them, or like the POF minus strains take away that character, or putting enzymes that are already used in the brewing process and are approved by the FDA as GRAS, which means they're safe to use in brewing, but making it in a kind of more convenient form, or timing the expression of that enzyme to correlate with the dry hop and allowing you to really get the use of that enzyme, versus sometimes they're not necessarily going to be active during that time. So
it's almost like I like to think of it more as you're not adding anything to these genetically modified strains that are from some other species, right? These are already produced in different yeast strains, perhaps, but it's nothing new that's not already being through the normal fermentation process.
Exactly. And Omega, the way we've approached it, we've taken the cisgenic, which means it's all yeast derived. We haven't necessarily taken any other pathways. So there's a lactic acid producing yeast. That's a really awesome tool, and I 100% am on board with it. But that's technically transgenic because it takes a bacterial or a fungal derived lactate dehydrogenase enzyme and puts it into yeast. I think most of us feel like sour beer is safe, and our own cells have lactate dehydrogenase. So this is something that, we just have to take into account and understand a little bit more so we can feel comfortable with the approach.
I don't know. I've had some sour beer that I wasn't sure was safe.
Well, biogenic amines, but guess what?
I'm just kidding.
That's because you're using lacto. That's no, I mean, there's other, there's other concerns for safety that don't even have to do with genetically engineered yeast, that could be based on how you source the wild strains you're using. So, right. Just try to feel like you've done your due diligence, what you're using, and that, organizations like us, Omega Yeast, have gone through the GRAS notice and made sure that, we've revealed everything that we've done to generate these organisms, and that they're safe, because they're akin to your normal brewing strain.
Johan,
I did my best.
But can we move to the next one, Scott? Because we got 18 more questions.
Yeah, let me say this real quick though. I did write a blog post about these genetically modified strains, because a lot of these terms are probably, foreign to a lot of people. They were to me, before I wrote it. That really breaks this down, and I think gets you a better understanding of the whole process that we talked about today, and the different types of GM strains. So if you're interested in that, I think that'll help clear up some questions.
Good point.
What's the name of the blog post? And it's at scottjanish.com, right?
Yep. And then just search genetically modified strains. Honestly, I can't remember what it is.
No, it's a really good post. Honestly, you'll have a lot to read, because there's quite a bit there. But
while we're answering the next one, I thought we'd just enjoy the contrast of these beers. Beautiful beers. I have enjoyed tasting all of them. So are there any characteristics from brewing Hefeweizen that will help with a New England IPA? And that comes from Gary.
I would say the opposite, maybe. Scott knows a little bit more of our work on haze, but I've brewed Hefeweizens where I've struggled to get a good stable haze, and dry hopping is really effective at generating stable haze. So I could see that being an interplay between the two styles, and then open fermentation possibly. I know John Mallett talked about that in his mention of biotransformation. I don't know the research on that or what's involved in helping facilitate kind of really expressive fermentation. And then on the yeast side, if you're going with London 3, you like it because it makes a lot of esters. So Hefeweizen strains, if you underpitch or kind of ferment and stress them out a little bit, you get more ester profile. So similarly, you could try to coax out those esters in the hazy IPA strains.
Yeah, I think only thing I can really speak to on this is that we've brewed a beer. Actually, we're going to brew it again. I think it's on the calendar next month. But it's basically a co-pitch of the two. So taking a Hefeweizen strain, but pitching at like 5 or 10% of the yeast pitch. So for us, we essentially just buy a vial Hefeweizen yeast from like a homebrew pitch, make a starter, add that to our entire 10-barrel batch, and it just gets enough of this banana-y kind of thing, but it's very subtle, and it just kind of creates. We use it with cashmere hop, which already kind of has that a little bit on its own, and so yeast blending is fun when you're using, and that's kind of what Laura's been able to do with some of these strains is try by blending in different amounts. I'm trying to just keep certain things at a lower level. But that's one that I've enjoy a lot, is the 5 or 10% Hefeweizen yeast in a hazy IPA. It just gives you a little bit more yeast character, a little more just yeast esters and phenols can really just build to the complexity of a beer. But I think you just want them to be, in my opinion, I like them to be sort of just in the background. It's sort of part of the bigger picture of the beer. And so that's where the Hefeweizen blend is kind of fun to experiment with.
Yeah, and I think like bringing phenolics into a NEPA is like there's kind of no place for that, but the blend allows you to really reduce the phenolic amounts. And then if you want, you can use our puff minus Hefeweizen strain.
Is that actually available, Laura?
Yeah, it's called Bonanza. It's a strain we sell,
Bonanza.
and it's the typical German Hefeweizen strain, which should not, without phenolics. So it does not. I personally like Hefeweizens with a little phenolic. So
yeah,
I would like people to either blend it to get the right amount of phenolics with the nice German phenolic Hefeweizen strain, or take an approach like Scott and use it in another context and make something like a banana milkshake IPA or something.
Yeah, we did do that. When is there a Cosmic Punch release soon, or is that on the radar?
I just have to, it's kind of, thankfully I'm not working a lot on that anymore. It's all fun to our marketing team, so it's definitely coming out soon. And we've had Scott work with it, some other breweries who have we've trialed it with, and we just wanted to see their opinion and approach to using it so that we know when we go to talk to the rest of our customers that we're giving them kind of the right advice and learning things.
Cool.
Gary, great question. Let's move to the next one. And Laura, you're actually pinned for this one. Paul asks, has Omega engineered any of the wine strains known for their biotransformation properties and removed the killer factor? Is that possible? I've had the opportunity to experiment with the famous thiol-releasing strain blend known as Alchemy 2. But a major concern for brewers is that it introduces the killer plus factor in the brewery, as it can be disastrous.
So there is a definite way of removing killer factor that doesn't require genetic editing or engineering. It's you can grow the strains on ethidium bromide and select for. I mean, it might also generate petite mutants, which you might not want, but it is a way of kind of curing the strains from that killer factor. Honestly, like I'd have to really understand the literature behind not using killer strains in production and exactly what the threat is. I think maybe a co-culture would be more of an issue, but using a killer strain, it is a secreted toxin. So if you're not CIPing or you're having issues getting kind of the protein content or sheet off of fermenter, possibly you'd get carryover. But it's like any enzyme in your process. Hopefully you're not getting carryover in your fermenter between other things. So I guess I would just say, like, if it's a strain you're using to ferment in isolation, maybe don't have so much concern. And then, I mean, you got diastatic yeast too to think about cross-contamination. I would say they would be more of a threat than a killer strain. And then the other thing about the Alchemy strain, we've done a lot of these really, really awesome wine strains that are high in beta lyase activity in beers. And unfortunately, because beer has the high amounts of nitrogen, you really don't turn that pathway on in the wine strain. Even though you know it's an active pathway, it doesn't get turned on in beer fermentations. So Scott probably can talk about using one of our first kind of attempts at bringing thiols into beer, and it was a beer wine hybrid, because you have to get maltodextrose and maltose utilization out of your yeast, the brewing strain, and then you hybridize it to a wine strain with high beta lyase activity, and you get the best of both worlds. Well, it's a little more complicated. We found that out. So what we took is the genetic editing and kind of an ability to enhance the beta lyase activity in beer fermentations, which was much more promising to us, and probably a little bit why it's a hard thing to study, is because you have assumptions that it's going to work, and you do it again and again, and it doesn't work, and you're like, what happened? And I think that's what Scott was talking on, and it certainly was our experience too. We had some ideas, tested them, and just weren't getting the results we wanted.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to clarify, because I'm not sure I heard the answer. So is there a wine strain with the killer factor removed?
Oh,
Is that
there.
available from Omega?
So Omega doesn't sell wine strains. We sell brewing strains. So we don't actually sell to wineries either, unless they want a brewing strain or Kvike. But anyway, so yes, there are wine strains available that are killer negative and are POF minus and are IRC7 beta lyase active, but they're not going to work in beer. So, I mean, to the level to you getting the perceived sensory threshold. When we're talking to getting above 60 nanograms per liter, those strains might teeter and reach that level in beer, but they're not going to be up to the amount where we're tenfold above sensory threshold with the genetically edited strains. And even Scott can talk on that. It's not overwhelming.
So what he's looking for is not available from Omega, and you're
Won't work.
not aware of it being available from anywhere else.
I guess like I've tried it, and we've done the chemistry to see if thiol compounds were released, and it wasn't as pronounced, and it wasn't reaching the amounts that were like significantly above sensory threshold. So we can be, limited in our scope and not have tried every wine strain. But when we did those initial studies, we weren't really seeing the results we wanted to see with thiol release.
So it seems
Right. So
like
you're
an
really just saying
impossible
there's a better approach. I think that's kind of what it is, and it's just a more targeted approach when the way they've gone. When I was just in here, we had our tasting room manager just brought in. So like this is a piquette seltzer that we're making, and that is with these genetically engineered strains, and it's pretty fun. And I think some wineries might want to start using them because it really does change the character of some of the things. This one is actually this one is used. So there's I don't know how many yeast labs are making these strains now, but Berkeley Yeast is another one that is doing this too. And we use their tropic strain with some wine grapes and compared it to a wine yeast only ferment and this ferment, and it's remarkably different. And so there's it really depends on what you're after, but all these strains, they're all behave a little differently, and yeah, it's a good question because that alchemy strain was always a little confusing to me because it was a blend of strains kind of, and some were known to be killer, and so that always was confusing to me. I believe that's the case. Looks like Laura's thinking no.
I wasn't sure if it was like actually like a interspecific hybrid or if it was a blend of strains. I forget. I remember looking at it at one point. There's a bunch of them. There's like Vin 7, Vin 13, Maxithiol, a lot of them that are advertised for that activity.
I believe the one that he mentioned was majority Vin 7, and then it had some other ones in it too. I tried using that a handful of times in hazy hoppy beers, and again, it was that weird yeasty phenolic thing that just kind of, it just took a New England IPA into more of like a Saison or a Belgian territory that distracted from what I was after in the strain. So, and I guess we could take more questions, but we haven't talked about using commercial enzymes either, and that's another route that I've experimented with. But
well, and I'm glad you said that, Scott. We have 20 questions in about 35 minutes, so we can't even quite do it at 2 minutes a question. So I think we're going to have to pick up our pace. Paul, what a great question. I hope Chuck's is shorter. Can you comment on the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service labeling requirements for bioengineered products that have been produced in breweries that do not have the BE labeling exemption provided by the FAA Act?
I think I would just touch on the fact that if it's a cisgenic change, the USDA is not recognizing them as genetically modified currently. So there are a lot of CRISPRed cisgenic things that are not under GMO regulation. But I don't honestly know the exact labeling exemption for bioengineered strains that you're talking about. That's something that's going to become more relevant, certainly. I think even the USDA and FDA will have more labeling requirements. So I think we're all still, I mean, what we do at Omega is we go through our GRAS notice and we share with the FDA the approach that we've taken to make these strains. And then that is kind of what our requirement is currently. And these are food additives as well. So it's not like your corn, which you're eating and consuming. It's yeast that produces the fermented beverage. So
is the short answer, there's no change required for your yeast right now?
I honestly don't have the answer. I just have the answer that I'm familiar with, and I think there's probably better people at Omega that can speak to it.
Okay. And Scott, do you have anything on that one?
Nope, that is thankfully not something I have to worry about yet. I guess it might change how we would have to potentially label beers made with it, I suppose. For now, we're just, every time we use them, we just say it. I mean, we just say it's an engineered strain that's made to, increase the fruity aromatics of your beer. And we've honestly never had anyone really be too concerned with it or push back. More just curiosity and a lot of questions from homebrewers of, like, how can I get that strain? Can I take this can home and harvest the dregs? That has been done. So, but yeah, that's, I don't know a lot about that. So I will stay out of that realm right now.
Yeah, I think mainly what I would be aware of at this point is that breweries using it, there's no requirement of labeling. But I would say it's probably the best approach to just take a full, honest transparency to the process, just to avoid anything, any question of a consumer. It's like kind of disclosing an allergy. If somebody has a belief or an opinion on the product, or potentially doesn't want to be drinking, at least they know beforehand.
Right. It's confusing too, because it's like, well, if you use genetically modified corn in your beer, should you be saying that on your label too, or other types of grains, or
all of the enzymes we use in brewing are produced by recombinant organisms, which are genetically engineered. So it's just that's what the yeast is in this process. It's the organism that ferments the beer, and similarly to the bacterial from bioreactors that produce the enzymes we use in beer. It's kind of a fuzzy, I guess, a fuzzy question.
Okay, well, we got to keep going. We got 30 minutes and 19 questions. Cody asks, what is the target release date for OYL-402 Cosmic Punch? It
is absolutely soon. I know they're right on the cusp of it. I would say if you're interested, you can email sales at omegayeast.com and just see if they're able to set an order date for you. Not my department.
Cody has another question that's popular. What are you looking for when choosing what hops to use for biotransformation? I haven't seen Scott's blog post about Whirlpool survivables, but is there a list that shows which hops might perform best during biotransformation?
In terms of using these strains for, unlocking some of these bound compounds, I don't know if you can throw that chart up again that you had on. That was one. So that was one study. I believe they looked at 17 different hop varieties and looked at how many of the these cis-3-MH precursors these hops had. And so if you're looking for higher biotransformation potential in terms of unlocking some of these, Calypso, you can see on the left, is really high. Saaz and Simcoe, and then it looks like another variety of Saaz or different lot. I'd have to look into that, why there's two. Nugget, Cascade, to me, it's interesting if you look at the like survivables chart that, Yakima Chief has done some research into, which compounds, like they almost like worked backwards. So they looked at a finished hoppy beer and examined it for which hop compounds were in there, and then went backwards to see which hops had like the highest percentage of all these different, thiols and monoterpene alcohols and, hop derived esters. And so like a lot of these ones that were high in survivables were also high in, there's overlap between these bound hops. So like Cascade, Columbus, these are probably just great ones to start experimenting with in the whirlpool to try to really, especially when you're using some of these engineered strains, to really push the potential of those hops even further. So for us, I guess it's easier just to look at it kind of how we approach it. It's like here at the brewery, we use a lot of Mosaic, Simcoe, Bravo, Amarillo, Saaz, Cascade, and Columbus in the whirlpool, and pretty much all of our beers right now. We just feel like we get the most bang for our buck with those. They survive better. They have more of these bound compounds, and it's just not worth adding, the Citras, the Galaxies, to the whirlpool in terms of, a lot of times if you taste your beer before you dry hop it, so after fermentation, and this is probably less so with, engineered strain, but with like a typical ale strain, a lot of times you don't smell a lot of hop character, you don't taste a lot of hop character. It just kind of just tastes, kind of like beer at that point. That's where these survivable compounds and these survivable hops help. There's just a little bit more to those beers at that stage. And I would say even, turn that up even a little bit more if you're using an engineered strain. So I kind of forgot the question, but I'm done with talking.
Well, I think in its simplest form, they just wanted to know if there was a chart or some information on which hops to choose for biotransformation.
Yeah, so that chart is a great one. That's on the GM article I wrote. I hope that there's a lot more of this bound compound information that'll start appearing with the hops data set that you get for brewers. I think that would be great. In fact, now it's even rare to see thiols in general in their free form on a lot of these on the hops you buy. That it's still focusing on the geraniol and linalool and alpha acid, beta acid type thing. So I think what these yeast strains that have the potential like this is really putting not pressure on hop suppliers, but it's just increasing the knowledge, I think, of brewers, and they're more interested in not just the hop variety, but what that variety has in terms of its whole set of oils. So hopefully just more and more information starts coming out on what hop each individual hop has in terms of bound and free compounds, as well as the ones we're already interested in, like the geraniol and linalool. So
okay.
Again, it's also going to be the variety like that you choose, but down to the crop selection, the year, the region. So all of that's it's just really hard. I think the hop suppliers are going to be pressured to provide more information in their breakdowns of the oil composition and free thiols or precursor.
Right. I would love to see that.
Yeah. And I think what you've seen with like Yakima Chief, they've started to do that with their hop reports.
Right.
Okay. 17 questions, 26 minutes. So at least I'm going to start a timer. So next most popular question, Joseph asked, does water chemistry change, such as gypsum and calcium chloride modifications, also affect the yeast characteristics with the flavor and aroma of malt and hops used? Water chemistry seems important as well.
And I think that's related to the next question too. So let's try to combine a little. I would say I'm not aware of the specific like minerality of your water that it will impact a biotransformation event. But it certainly will play into the perception of hop quality and aroma, and also what I think what Scott has leaned on a little bit, talking about how these impact aging and oxidation and issues downstream. But not as far as I can tell, like biotransformation events aren't necessarily needing some cofactor from the water profile.
Yeah, there has been, there's some studies that show like a correlation between like higher sulfate ratios and less perception of hop flavor in a beer. And that kind of makes sense to me. You think of a beer that's really high in sulfates. It comes across drier, and to me, like the drier the finish, the quicker the flavor can cut off a little bit in terms of hop flavor. That's kind of just my opinion. That kind of if it's a really dry beer, like if you have a little bit of sweetness still in a really hoppy beer where you front loaded a bunch of hops, it seems like you get this hop saturated flavor that kind of lingers on your tongue a little bit. But if it's too dry, that can kind of stop a little bit quicker. So that's a little bit of a reason why we up our chloride over sulfates in those beers. But yeah, in terms of biotransformation, I'm not sure that I think it's the biotransformation is more of an enzyme thing, and it's less of a water treatment, water mineral thing. But that's not to say that water is not important.
Yeah, I think there's probably there's another question down towards the bottom with the copper tubing and other processes that might impact thiols. Certainly there are chelators of these compounds because they're sulfur compounds. So something to think about as far as like the introduction of those divalent cation metal ions. But I think maybe for water profile, I would just try to focus on the things that Scott was saying related to the perception of hops and how they impact the overall sensory versus the biotransformation events.
Jim also says he enjoys hearing from you, Laura.
Jim had lots of questions.
Yes, he did.
Thank you.
Okay, Ron's got the next question. Are brewers in Europe experimenting or employing with biotransformation?
I think everyone is doing it in some way, whether they probably know it or not. I mean, like we were saying earlier, just like that geraniol to beta citronellol thing, going to more that like lime citrus thing, that's happening in a lot of beers that are just traditional ales that are, have, decent amount of hops in the whirlpool. But, some of these, aged hop lambic things are kind of interesting, because I bet you there's some happening there. You're using some aged hops, and then, it's in the presence of Brett, and, beta glucosidase is likely active, and it sits for a long time. And especially if some of this is happening, we've talked a little bit about how it doesn't matter necessarily when you add these hops during the dry hop. If you let it go long enough, it's almost like the biotransformation happens in its own time. If that's probably not the best way to say it, but it's interesting to think how much could happen in a year or two in a barrel when you have a bunch of precursors. I don't know the answer to that, but so I think.
How about the engineered yeast? Are they being used in Europe?
Well, so I think it's overall the EU doesn't necessarily. So they have different definitions than our USDA does for genetically engineered or genetically modified organisms. So any use of a tool that is employed, like CRISPR, is considered genetically modified, versus in the US, right? Currently, it's if there's transgenic material introduced. So it's stricter over there. I would Scott is right on, these Brett fermentations and kind of secondary fermentations in bottles and traditional approaches might exist for a reason. And some might be that secondary fermentation is helping to be this biotransformation event. And especially with the amount of wine literature and research done in Europe, there's a lot of focus on thiol compounds. And yes, it's a big topic over there as well for biotransformation.
Okay. David has a question. How important are yeast starters for home brewers?
We have a motto here at Omega that, we propagate custom orders because we think that fresh yeast is the best yeast. So, yes, if you can do a starter, why not? And you're going to reinvigorate your yeast and get it healthy and active for fermentation. In its storage state, it's kind of depleting its reserve. It's depleting its glycogen and kind of starving. So waking it up a little bit.
Clarified that he was talking about genetically modified yeast.
Oh yeah,
Is it
any yeast.
even
These
more
are
important?
So the genetically engineered yeast, or the ones that we have made at Omega, you should treat them exactly like the parental strain, as far as expecting the same performance out of them. So anything you would do with your London 3, do it with Cosmic Punch. And when you think of like London 3 is 1318 juice, a lot of other names in the industry, it's all kind of London Fog. They're all this hazy IPA strain that we call British 5. So not to add more confusion, but just to help clarify.
Next question, Gary asks, my brewery has a lot of copper tubing. Am I going to have thiol problems and not be able to effectively make a hazy ale?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there is, it'd be interesting. It's too bad that to get your beers tested for thiols, it's so expensive, and hopefully that, when the one time I did in the book, I tried to do just a small experiment where I took, I brewed one beer and whirlpooled or chilled it with a copper chiller, and one I chilled with a stainless steel chiller, just to see if the thiol content changed much. This was 4 years ago when I brewed it, and I had to send that beer to France to get tested by a wine lab. It cost hundreds of dollars, and it came back and it's like neither beer had really any thiols in it. And that's just because I think we're just further behind. Then we know more about how to push those into beers now. Maybe exactly how that might impact it. But you could always introduce, if you introduce the hops or the thiols and the thiol precursors past where your copper tubing is an option. You can always kind of bypass it, make little teas or add stuff directly to a fermenter. But I have a hard time thinking it would absorb like all of your thiols, but I guess.
I mean, it does if you've ever put pennies into a beer that has H2S, it certainly makes a difference.
Right?
Yeah. So I would say for sure you want to avoid any copper if you're trying to emphasize that thiol character.
Right. And that's kind of why those
bottom line.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's why a lot of the, hops and where people use copper as it's like a fungicide, right? I think people use them to keep their crops healthy. And that's, in the regions where that happens, there's less thiols in those hops.
Exactly. Copper fungicides are correlated with lower amounts of these compounds in the agricultural context.
So Jason has our next question. Is biotransformation considered either the freeing of a compound and or the changing of a confrontation of more complex compounds? I'm sort of a novice, and I realize that these compounds might not be variable structures. Just curious.
So I would say, I'm going to put this up really quick. This is kind of how I think of biotransformation. Is it showing?
Yeah, but it's blinking for some reason.
Okay, here we go.
There
we go. Is that better?
Yes.
Transformation of chemical compounds within a living system. So we talked about conversion of geraniol to beta-citronello. That's one example. Esters can be converted between saccharine and Brettanomyces. That's another example. POF is an example, phenolic character. It's really like activity by an organism converting compounds to new aroma compounds is what I would perceive that. Kind of define it as. And I think in the context that we normally refer to it as, is it's like kind of that mid-fermentation dry hop effect of yeast and hops interacting in fermentation. But it's pretty broad. I think biotransformation could be considered just sugar to ethanol. So kind of.
Yeah, I like to, maybe I don't think about it necessarily how I should technically, but to me, it's either like a compound is changing to another or being freed. I mean, that's kind of how I look at it. But I guess if it's being freed, it's being changed, right? And so it's kind of the same thing in a way. But in terms of how we're looking at it in increasing hop flavor and aroma and whatnot, I think that's the most simplified way for me to kind of look at it. And I like to think of it as being transitioning from one compound to another and freeing bound compounds, because it's like, it's different. Those are two different like pathways, different enzymes, and how that happens, different yeasts. So to me, it's easier to break some of the biotransformation stuff into little segments, so I can think about them differently, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a broad term, but overall, it's kind of talking about the enhanced aroma or a new aroma, kind of yeast activity on the raw material to kind of help promote that formation of the new aroma.
All right. Jim asks a question. He might have to clarify if he's still online and put it in the chat. But what would be the result of a secondary fermentation on grape must and dry hopping?
Secondary fermentation on grape must and dry hopping. I mean, I'm assuming he means with one of these strains, a genetically engineered strain. I mean, I think. It'd be interesting to try. I mean, the precursors would be there, right? And you'd have a whole nother round of fermentation. It seems possible to get some bioconverting. Does that sound accurate to you? I mean, it's not a vigorous primary ferment at that point, but you're still, introducing a lot of simple sugars. So it seems like there's potential there. In fact, we've done it. I guess I've used one of these strains with wine juice added. It's not necessarily a second ferment, but 4 days into the primary ferment, so things are starting to slow a little bit, but there's a big, good, healthy yeast still in there and active, and then letting that, because you're going to get, in our experience, we got a bunch of we got that wine character in there, but it also did seem a little bit altered in a fruitier kind of way. And that's just, I think, the enzyme activity that was in there with the yeast. So doing that in combination with hops is fun, because you're just potentially increasing that chance even more.
This is something that has been kind of relating to this grape must question. The pumice and the press that's left over from grapes has been made into a product called Phantasm, and it's specifically from the New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc grapes, which are really known to have high amounts of these free thiols and precursor compounds. So we've played around with it a little bit in combination with that Cosmic Punch strain. So wort alone, we'd already showed this, the levels are really high and just a wort fermentation. But we can double that by adding this grape-derived product, and it's really just the skins and the stems left over from the winemaking process. It's nothing. I guess it's gonna. I think it will probably be more widely available. It's really more on the Instagram kind of buzz right now, but it is kind of an interesting concept of that beer wine hybrid. So allowing wine raw material of the wine grapes to add more precursor, and Scott played around with that a ton. But I think being able to even pack more precursor in is just getting to those grape products and bringing more of that precursor in.
Yeah, and almost without one of these engineered strains or enzymes that can release them, there's not a huge impact from those products, at least in the little bit I've talked to people and done. It's almost like adding all those precursors is great, but you got to have the right tool in there to convert it.
So just what he's saying right here is exactly it's just above sensory threshold with just the Phantasm, and no. The engineered strain is tenfold that of what the the non-engineered strain is. But you can get just barely above threshold, but it's just definitely, I mean, that's like a trained sommelier saying I can get this compound. So yeah, you've got potential there alone. Unless there's a yeast that can access that precursor, it's just not going to bring a ton of flavor. And this was at 2 pounds per barrel in the whirlpool of this product. So it was a good load.
Okay, we are 8 questions and 10 minutes, and my platform has a very abrupt and hard stop at 2 hours. So let's try and get through these so we don't have the abrupt end. Curious to know which brewery in El Salvador, Scott, that you were working with.
Well, actually, so I was there to judge beers from all over Central America. So I was lucky enough to taste beers from all over there, and not working particularly with one individual one necessarily. But it was fun. It was a homebrew competition, and it's amazing what homebrewers are interested in there, and the kind of beers that they choose to brew, and which ones stand out and which ones don't. And I think it has, it's a lot to do with equipment and ingredients, and like their mixed fermentation wild beers were some of the better ones I've had. And so it's interesting that the world has a unique spin on beers, and particularly like using your advantages. Some of the mixed fermentation beers with their exotic fruit were amazing, and so they can't get Galaxy and Citra hops, but we can't get some of that grapefruit. So sometimes you just kind of have to brew to the area, or you take advantage of what you have at your disposal. But yeah, I was lucky enough to try a bunch of beers from all over. But Cadejo is the brewery that predominantly hosted me, and they have multiple locations throughout Central America. And I'm sure I just pronounced that wrong. That's embarrassing.
Sounds like you had some delicious beers.
Yes, right. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael. Good question. Jason asks, when you're engineering a yeast, am I wrong to assume that you are shooting to add an enzyme that will react to a hop in a certain way? Coming from a forensic background, I keep wondering about quality control of the various steps using mass or laser spectrometry, which is probably overkill.
Yeah, I think we've got really cool molecular genetic techniques that don't require any lasers. It's actually, so this system called CRISPR-Cas9, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, and if not, it's an editing technique that is very, very, very specific. The Nobel Prize was awarded for this technology. It's so up and coming. It's used in molecular, like therapeutics now currently, for treating like sickle cell and other diseases. So it's a revolutionary technology. So we've used that, and it's a very easy way for us to take a very targeted approach. So when we do it, it's like molecular tweezers. We're able to go right into a specific region of the genome and change as little as one base pair, and everything else remains the same. So, and we just do quality control on just to confirm the site and everything has been edited as we expected genetically, and then we do the phenotypic characterization. But it's a very really neat tool.
Well, it would be a lot cooler if you used lasers, though.
Yeah, I would love. I like that better than molecular tweezers.
Less than 6 minutes and 6 questions. So Jason had another question. How much natural mutation occurs in a batch of engineered yeast?
It doesn't have to be engineered yeast. You can look at work from the Dunham Lab and University of Washington. Yeah, it's happening in your regular yeast. So there's genetic drift and founder effect and all sorts of things that you can consider when serial repitching your yeast. And it has nothing. There's no specific correlation to that happening in our genetically engineered yeast. Once we have made the edit, that machinery is gone. We no longer we confirmed that we have gotten rid of the machinery, and it's the parental cell, aside from the specific change that we made. So
Okay, less than 5 minutes and 5 questions. Is Cosmic Punch being released only in liquid form or also in dry yeast?
it will only be in liquid form. So we're liquid yeast.
Laura, do you have a blog, a podcast, book, or other resources?
She should have all of them.
Yeah, if you check out any of my social media, it'll mostly be like sourdough and children. So sorry.
I
But I
wanna hear
have,
about your sourdough.
yeah, I love baking sourdough, and we have a tangy dough project here at Omega Yeast where we kind of play around with different sourdough cultures from different regions of the world, mostly from different random kitchens of our employees. But
Well,
we have a lot of fun.
We'll have to talk about that.
Yeah.
Next question. Thales asks, do you have experience with vitamin supplementation for hazy IPA, specifically those high on adjuncts? Great work, by the way.
I was always wondering if ascorbic acid would be a good thing because it prevents, oxidation. I don't really know, though, as far as other reasons to include a vitamin.
Ascorbic acid slows down oxidation? No kidding.
Yeah. I don't, I know we've played, I mean, we do a lot of like fun experiments here and there, but I think we tried to purposely oxidize the beer with ascorbic acid and it had less of an impact. So I think it is I don't know how common it is, but otherwise I'm not sure on vitamins. There's certainly a lot of vitamins in wort. Gives the yeast a lot of the nutrition they need. And I don't know if adding more vitamins would be a benefit.
Okay, less than 3 minutes, 2 questions left. Jason asks, how was the sensory threshold measured? Seems difficult knowing individuals have their own sensory and neural networks and pathways.
Usually done though through panels. Was kind of always my understanding. So it's almost kind of an average built in.
Yeah, and it depends on the context because all of the flavor compounds that are there with those compounds. So in different beverages, the thresholds will be different. And I think it's empirically judged by sensory and by people who are trained to those specific attributes. But yeah, in seltzer, for example, levels of fusel alcohol esters or aldehydes are going to be like very low threshold relative to beer because there's so much more going on. And that, I guess that would be, Scott, you probably talk about this, but in a dry hopped beer, you're getting so many more flavors coming in, it might overshadow some of these compounds as well. So I think the example of the Pilsner Urquell is really exciting because for me, that would be the blank slate of building on this complex aroma that would give people an idea of what to look for.
Okay, we have 90 seconds. We have Diego's question. Tom, we're not going to be able to get to yours. Can Kveik be blended with Sauvignon Blanc yeast?
Could be, yeah.
I think the benefits of Kveik being able to ferment warmer, you're going to get some issues on some other standard yeast, but
yeah, it's usually you do take the good and the bad with each blend, and if one can ferment really warm, then the other one probably can't. You might get some off flavors from that. So unless you're willing to ferment cooler, but yeah, I mean it could be done, could be good, but might not too.
I think it would be probably interesting, and like Scott said initially, and like these wine strains bring their own character, so it'll certainly change it up.
We have about 35 seconds, but first of all, I wanted to thank you guys for taking so much time answering all these questions. There's all kinds of wonderful accolades all in the chat there, how much they appreciate it. I know I appreciate it. Scott, Laura, this was absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, for joining and for helping me. And she answers a lot of my questions on various things and helps me out a bunch. And thank you for having us. It's just fun.
Okay. Bye-bye.
See ya. Cheers.
Cheers.